All right, here we go. Day 2.
All right. And
hello, everyone. I'm glad that you could make it today
on TikTok and Instagram. Sweet. All right. New background, feeling good.
That's awesome. Not bad at all. All right, the chat is ready to display messages, and we are all set. We are also, I believe, live on Facebook. D Live is the only one I want to check here because that one. See here. Oh. We got still offline. That's weird. All right, figure that out another day. Anyway, and we've connected something else. So now anybody who comments on any one of the platforms that's streaming us, the comment goes to the other platforms.
Oh, all right. Sweet. So that means anyone on any platform can see.
That's right.
All the other comments.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
I'm pretty excited about that. It's a good service, Restream. I'm not going to complain about it for sure.
Yeah, seems to be doing all right so far. So
this is great.
That is good to hear. Yeah.
I just want to mention to anybody who would be watching this after the fact, I don't know how many people are watching it right now, that we will be uploading these to Patreon and our other platforms. Actually, you'll find them on YouTube and whatnot after the fact. I didn't recognize that until yesterday. Actually, all of our live streams are still recorded on YouTube.
Oh, sweet. Nice.
Yeah.
Damn. Wait, so how many is that? Is that just from all the past ones we've done?
No, we're just going from this one forward because, of course, the last ones were more or less us live streaming recordings of our previous podcasts. This is actually the first time we've managed to do this like this and consistently, which I'm pretty stoked about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, all right. Yeah. Day 2.
Day 2. Oh, I got nothing to fly with right now. I am more or less just grooving off the review of yesterday. Yesterday went really, really well. Like just in general, not just the live stream, but the discussions afterwards. I found having these conversations like this and then going into the smaller group discussions with people, it's so much fun because this is like the warm-up period.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when they're on the live stream with us, and oftentimes they'll have questions coming in or whatever, and people don't really always feel like using the chat option, especially when they have the option to just join us live on a group call. Might as well do that. But yeah, those were a lot of fun. They go by so quick too. So yeah,
they do. But it's interesting because we get questions that kind of vary across the spectrum. Like it really depends on what the person's working on, but I like the fact that we managed to keep it fairly grounded. Like we were talking about depression yesterday. I love the fact that you're like, oh, okay, well, there's a lot of ways that we could tackle this. Which direction do we want to take? And that's really the point. Like somebody was saying, oh, don't you ever run out of things to say? It's like, no, because there are infinite ways to tackle pretty much everything. Like there's so many different avenues that you could look at a thing from and gain a different insight. It's just a matter of taking the time to do that and questioning your familiar surroundings enough that you can do that. Because sometimes it's hard to see things from a different angle if you're not willing to be aware that there are other angles.
Yeah. And it would make sense why people would be curious about whether we'll ever run out of things to talk about. And I think there is the opportunity for that to happen when you're very caught up in your beliefs, in the way that you think, and you think it's the right way to think all the time. Like there is a limit to that, because beyond that is uncomfortable, because you have to question your own thoughts about things. But if you're not holding on to anything so tightly and so closely, then it's like that's infinite. It's like your idea of yourself. When you have a very limited idea of yourself, there's a limit to that. Obviously, it's confined to certain ideas, certain thoughts, certain belief patterns. And as you let that go more and more, you see that, you are closer to infinite. The more you let that go, you see yourself in everything. So it would make sense. It's so fun, like as above, so below, with everything from our idea of ourself to conversations to all of this live streaming. Like we're being able to tap into infinite iterations of any type of conversation and perspective, because we're not holding on to anything as truth. And that's all it ever comes down to, whether it's our idea of ourselves or a conversation or thoughts about reality or any given topic. There's always going to be an infinite number of ways that you can go about it, unless you're holding on to the way you think is the only way or the right way to think about it, which will always limit it.
Jesus is the only Son of God. It's exactly the point, right? It's got to be this way. It's the only way it can be. And it's so amazing to me that people who believe in God have the most superficial idea of what God is. Like, it's so interesting that it's always kind of this father figure or this teacher figure or this caretaker figure. It's always somebody that conveniently takes responsibility for your life away from you. And it's always this very superficial concept. Whereas as soon as you start going, right, any idea of God that I have can't be God, because it's a limited idea, and the entire reality behind the concept of God is everything. That's not everything you can imagine. That's everything, which means no matter how much you've imagined, you're not there yet. You keep going. And that's the whole thing, but we don't, because we're like, no, it's God. And this is the relationship. And this is how God feels. And here's his rules. And here's his, so on and so forth. And now we've stopped questioning, where if we looked at the concept, God is everything, okay. And then we look at the concept of ourselves and we go, okay, so maybe I'm not this idea of myself, just in the same way God is not God, my idea of God. And then you start recognizing, oh shit, so if God is everything, I'm part of everything. Am I part of everything? Or am I the awareness of everything, acting through this part of everything? And immediately the gap starts to close. And this is where religion panics, because they're like, how do we put ourselves above people at that point?
Right. And it's like everyone wants to hold on and tell you, like we were talking about yesterday, that, this is my truth. Who are you to say, you have your beliefs, I have my beliefs, and let me believe what I want to believe, and all of those things. And we're not saying that we have a truth that we hold on to either, or that our truth is correct. It's that none of the truths that we hold on to is correct. And it's applicable to any situation, from conversations, from our idea of God, from our idea of ourselves, from our idea of other people. And as you recognize more and more clearly that none of the ideas are the truth, then it's all the same lack of ideas being the truth across all of it. And then you can see that that description of no idea being the truth is applicable to everything. And therefore, you are interconnected, intertwined with all of it, because it's the same lack of description for everything. It's not that description is similar and therefore it's all one. It's there's nothing that can properly describe you. There's nothing that can properly describe God. There's nothing that can properly describe anything that you point to. It's all just descriptions, and it's never what it actually is. And so that lack of definition, that lack of description, is uniform across everything. And through that, you can see yourself in everything.
You've been really digging the Krishnamurti lately, eh?
I have. Yeah. I listened to like 30 minutes on my walk with my dog this morning. I got through, now I'm through the second conversation. Yeah, I've been resonating a lot. A lot of it's still like, sometimes I'm like, I got to re-listen to that, but then I don't. I just keep it going. It just keeps moving on, because they touch on things multiple times. And Anderson, he doesn't always follow everything. So he's like, let's go back to this. I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. And it's super helpful to everyone.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of season 1. Very much.
Yeah.
Their conversation
I was
is very
just
much
thinking the same exact thing.
It's
Yeah.
so true, because you did the same thing. You're like, all right, hold on. Let's go back a bit. I really want to flesh that out, because I'm not sure I see what you're saying. And because of that, we made pretty significant strides in season 1. Season 1's trippy. Like, I'm not gonna lie, season 1 of Dualistic Unity is trippy. If you really get into it, if you get through episode 1 all the way through to the last episode, you will feel close to being on psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny how, because I got to go back and listen to all of that, but it was very much that I was starting to see things, had a lot of questions, and was super curious about all of it, because I felt like I felt pretty clear at that point too, but there was still a lot of places I was getting caught up in. And it was like, I was just, as our first episode so aptly describes, scratching the surface of all of it. And it's so funny how when the season starts, I hadn't done psychedelics. Then it's like 2 episodes in, that's it. And then it just starts snowballing from there. But it's very much, and people, I talked to a bunch of people at the retreat too, who said, like, with our relationship and our repertoire, like, that season one is a perfect segue into all of this. It's like the intro to sort of everything, because I still have so many questions that so many people come to, and everyone, I feel like everyone on some level is curious about those questions, whether they see anything beyond their idea of themselves as being potentially something intertwined with themselves or not. It's still something that's in there, even from people who are super locked in to their beliefs. And a lot of times they just push those thoughts and ideas away and they resist them, but it's still there. And so it's awesome that we have that whole season one. And even just like the first 5 episodes, I haven't even listened back to the 4 and 5. I think I've only been through 1, 2, and 3 for a second time. But yeah, I'm very glad that's there.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I'm going to ask that you don't go back and listen to season 1 again. Not quite yet, because we were planning on doing a season 1 commentary series. And I think that would be fantastic. We could do that maybe after New Year's or something like that, where basically we take an episode and we just listen to it, we pause it, we talk, we go through the insights, we kind of reminisce on how long of a journey it's been since I said that weird ass thing that didn't make sense. And all of a sudden you're like, aha, it kind of makes sense now. And that's going to be a lot of fun, because I know there was a lot of points in season 1 where there were questions that you had asked that I had spent many years going, I don't know how I'm going to answer that when it comes up. And so it's kind of neat to see how, I guess, the process of making Dualistic Unity has really helped me learn something cerebrally that at one point I had to learn physically in martial arts, which was flow state. Like it's one thing to be in a conversation with somebody and touching into flow state in that, and that's easy enough. I mean, you just let go around people that you're comfortable with and you can kind of get into that. But every one of these episodes, and I love the fact that people witnessed this at the retreat. We have no idea what we're going to talk about when we enter into an episode. Literally, we just sat down at the retreat, set up our mics, and started talking. And that's all we ever do. Same with this morning. Anybody who watched this from the first few minutes knows we had a little bit of a slow takeoff as we were getting our brains together and going, right, human word noises. It's time to play that game again. And now here we are, we're going. But we never know what we're going to talk about, because that would get in the way. Genuinely, I think that would get in the way. The one thing I like about all of our seasons is that from season 1 to season 2 to season 3, there is this almost natural, organic progression to the conversation. Like, it starts off just you and I, season 1. Season 2, we get a few more people in, we get roundtable, Discord starts to grow, the community starts to grow, there's more people being involved, we're talking more about the conversations we're having than just having our own. Season 3, tons of guests, all of a sudden the community is growing, everything's the conversation's getting wider, and it's less and less and less about you and I. And that's why it's so important that we go into this with no idea what we're going to talk about, because so long as we're engaged with the community, honestly, and we are enthusiastically engaged with our community, we love them, we love the conversations. That's what's informing these episodes. Our brains just feeding all that in from those conversations from our life, and then we get here and it has a chance to come out as whatever the hell it is, which is the accumulated insights of our community. It's a nice role to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually funny you bring that up, because a lot of times what will happen is one of us will have something written down, or I'll have one note of like, this would be fun to chat about. And a lot of times we don't even get to it. Like we go through and we don't even get to the one thing that I had written down in 2 fucking hours. And it's like, Jesus Christ, that's awesome. But it's also funny because I come into it with it. And the one thing I had written down today was, because I've been listening to a lot of Krishnamurti, a lot of those ideas are coming in. And so the idea of yourself, or yourself, not just the idea of yourself, just yourself, is it entirely an idea? A lot of times we get caught up in saying like, oh, well, I have this body and whatnot. And it's like, even the idea that you have it, that it belongs to you, belongs to the idea of you that you hold on to. So is yourself simply an idea? And so as you let go more and more of that being what you are, you find more freedom, you find more peace, you find more joy. And what you just mentioned about how as we progress through the seasons, it's become less and less about us. And is that not perfectly applicable to our lives, and getting to a place of, or not getting, but recognizing freedom within ourselves is less and less of ourself is involved. And that freaks people out because they're like, it's essentially what death is the letting go of your idea of yourself. So it freaks people out because that's what they're so afraid of with death, is having there being no idea of themselves, the end of the illusion, the end of the idea. But what they don't see, and because I don't know if it's been experienced by that many people in our reality, is living without almost any idea of yourself. And not to the point that, Suzanne goes with the non-duality belief system and whatnot, but just being the experience and being so intertwined and enthralled with it without so many thoughts about the idea relative to others. Because even with the body being a part of you, it's still all relative. It's still, your thoughts about your body are still relative to everyone else that you see. You have thoughts about how you look, what certain body parts look like, and it's all relative. If there were no other people, you wouldn't know what those were. And so those are still just ideas that are relative. And so all our entire life is in relativity to reality. But as we let go more and more of us being something that could be relative to anything else, there's less idea that we hold on to, and there's more freedom. There's no hesitation or disconnect between the experience that we're having. And how often does that get in the way? Like it's getting in the way constantly throughout our days, throughout our weeks, throughout our experiences. Is that there is no conflict without I. Like that's Krishnamurti quote, like fucking hits so hard. But as I started with, that idea that ourself, is it not entirely an idea?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes and no, both and neither, right? Like, yes, as soon as you think of yourself, that's no longer you. That's the point, because what you're thinking of is always a product of the past. It's always a product of assumption. It's always a product of a divisive perception. That's it. It couldn't be a thought otherwise. And the brain doesn't know how to do anything else. The brain is a dualistic machine. It's a comparison machine. That's what it does. That's how it processes information, is via comparison to what it thinks it knows. And that's where we get context. And so you can't really get out of that. So as soon as you apply the property of perception onto yourself, you've created an illusion that, unfortunately, because you are so powerful, because your mind, your awareness is the basis of what you consider to be reality. Well, as soon as you create that illusion of yourself, it feels real. And we don't recognize we have that power. We don't recognize that God is so limitless, it can fool itself into thinking it has limitation, which is a real kick in the ass and really impressive when you think about it, because as anybody who's watching this knows, it's kind of hard to lie to yourself. Right? You would actually have to create an environment so stressful and so distracting that you didn't have a moment to go, I'm still lying to myself. And doesn't that sound familiar? And that's the experience of duality. It is so all-encompassing and so convincing, we forget it's just a perception. But what remains when we're not shining that light of awareness or perception at ourselves and thinking it's real is just will embodied. That's all it is. It's just will embodied, and empathy and whatever the hell all of that means. We describe it as different emotions and whatnot. It's a spectrum of all things, but it's flowing from one moment to the other, from one person to the other, just like a cell in the body, just like a neuron firing, like just anything else. It's just that we get so caught up trying to be in control that we're very much like a muscle that's having a cramp. We're just tense. We just don't want to work with the rest of the body, right? And so we cause all kinds of pain and suffering as a result.
Yeah, like we were talking about yesterday, it really comes down to whether or not you take it seriously. And the idea is there's nothing wrong with the idea of yourself or any ideas that you recognize or hold on to or utilize, but it's just whether or not you take it seriously. And, God being so limitless that it can fool itself into thinking that it's limited is fascinating. And that's all it comes down to, like, so often, is whether or not you recognize that you don't have to take this seriously, that the ideas that you hold on to for that false sense of certainty aren't actually the truth. And it's just getting caught up in that. So it's not necessarily not having any ideas, it's just how tightly you hold on to them, how willing you are to let them go, and how quickly you're able to let them go and not bring them or superimpose them onto the situation. Like, you're able to go through into a new situation, and you're actually able to go into a new situation without so many ideas, because a lot of times we just don't even go into a new situation because of the ideas, because of the limitations of that idea. And how interesting is that we don't know what the situation could ever lead to, but we already have this idea of how it might go, or how it probably will go, or how we think it's going to go.
Or at the very least, how it'll go because of my lack of faith in myself.
Yeah.
Right? We'll actually admit, okay, I don't know how it's going to go, but I don't have any faith in myself, so it's probably going to go badly.
Yeah. And that's all. It's not even, because we'll get caught up in having, the positive idea of ourselves, and we're like, oh, I can do this, and build ourselves up. And that is helpful to a degree, but it isn't necessary. It's still like cutting you off a bit. It's still creating distortion. And
fear. It creates fear.
Yeah.
That's the problem with putting yourself up, standing on a chair. It can get kicked out from under you, right? It's just shaky. It's so important to remember that. Like, it feels good, but that's where the expression pride goeth before the fall, right? Because that's it. Like, if you're not proud, that fall doesn't happen, right? It doesn't mean you accomplish any less. It's just that it doesn't define you. It doesn't raise or lower your value. And that's the danger, is pride is still egotistical. It's still based on the idea of self-image and accumulated value through comparison to other people's achievements. It's insidious because it feels really good until it doesn't. And so that's the point, is keep going. Enthusiasm is its own reward. Like, there's nothing to accumulate about enthusiasm. What are you going to do? Somebody's like, oh, how are you doing? I've been enthusiastic for 23 hours so far. Like, you're not going to do that, like, because you don't care. Enthusiasm is always in the present. You don't give a shit how long you've been enthusiastic. You're just feeling it now. It's not a product of accumulation. It's not a product of achievement. It's not a product of increasing your value. It's the state of mind where none of that makes any sense, or none of that seems relevant. And you're just embodying your value in the moment by being fully immersed in what you're doing and allowing your potential a chance to express itself. So isn't it funny? As soon as you try to be more, you do less.
Yes. Yeah. And with that positive idea of yourself, like, there's always going to be a trade-off, kind of like having confidence versus drinking a bunch to get liquid confidence. Like, drinking a bunch of alcohol is like, there's going to be a trade-off to that. So, like, holding on to a positive idea of yourself is like, works, yes, but there's going to be a trade-off, and there's always the potential for someone to kick that out from under you. Like, you're holding on to something that isn't just being in it for the sake of being in it. Like, you're still holding on to an illusion. And anytime you're holding on to an illusion that you're holding on to, there's the potential for someone to come in and change that illusion. Because as much as you can believe that so hard, believe it so hard and so good, like, it's still that illusion. It's still that idea that's separate from reality here and now that you're needing to hold on to. And so it's still distorting your experience. It's still taking away from enthusiasm, and acting enthusiastically for the sake of doing it is like 100% energy capacity going into whatever you're experiencing. Having a positive idea of yourself, there's still that amount that's getting taken away from your ability to experience it. So maybe, you're only able to give 70% energy to the experience you're having. If that's probably being generous, but the positive idea of yourself, or any idea of yourself, is taken away 50%. And then having a negative idea of yourself, maybe that's, taken away 70% or whatever. The numbers are arbitrary, but it's taking away from your ability to just be in that reality. And because when we have that positive idea of ourselves, we still have an idea of a positive outcome also. And that's still utilizing labels, thinking that we know what's best. And so it's letting go of not only the idea of yourself, but a positive outcome happening, as if you think you know what the best case outcome is in any situation. And the reason that we hold on to that positive idea of ourselves is because we hope for that positive idea or positive outcome to happen, thinking that we know what it is. So it's all intertwined with itself, like that desire for control when we don't actually have any idea. And that idea that we're holding on to of a positive outcome could be the worst outcome out of the two happening. And so it's relaxing into the recognition that we don't know and just being there for it. And that will then allow us to actually learn something and gain perspective and grow from it, as opposed to having this superimposed idea that will limit our growth, because it's already something that we have figured out in our head as something that is happening the way that we want it to. So it doesn't even leave opportunity for growth and shifts in perspective and all of that.
Yeah, well said. I want to address the arbitrary percentage because I think this is an important insight, and I really want you to sink into this one. Okay. Let's imagine that every concept that you hold on to, every divisive perception that you take as truth, cuts your potential in half. Starting with the first one, I. How many layers of I are there? How many perceptions of what I means do you have? Each one cutting your energy in half again. Drink it in, man, because that's exactly the point. The more you think about yourself, each and every layer cuts your potential in half.
Yeah. It's a lot of fucking halves getting cut right there. So it's not even the positive or negative definition. It's just the act itself. So anytime, even if it's 10 positive ideas, that's getting cut down to less than 1% because it's cutting you off, because you're no longer limitless. Any positive idea is a limit. Any idea is a limit. Positive, negative. The positive and negative is the arbitrary part. It's not the percentage. Huh.
Yeah. And when you drink that in, you really start to see how God limited itself down to a perception of a bag of meat on a rotating rock that doesn't know it's here. And that's exactly how he did it. Layer upon layer of self-delusion. Layer upon layer of divisive perception taken as truth. That's it. That's all it is. And the more we question the truth of it, that's it, just the truth of it. Like racism, it's a perfect example, right? Racism isn't real. It's the result of a perception that's based on an illusion that there's a division between people because of the skin color or because of their skin color. That's all illusion. Like that's all fictitious concept. That's all arbitrary, based on self-image and the need to evaluate yourself in comparison to your assumptions of others. That's it. That's all there is to that. And so once you go, maybe that division isn't real, racism ends. But the problem is that we're so committed to our self-image that we're not willing to question that divide, because it is how we evaluate ourselves. It's how we feel better about who we are and what we're doing in the world. And it's all part of the same illusion that wouldn't make any sense if we would relax a little bit and question the truth of our thoughts, the truth of our divisive perceptions, but we take them at face value. We go, I'm afraid of that person, therefore they must be scary.
So with something like racism, then the way we're going about trying to solve it and fix it by utilizing identity. I know we've talked about this before, but it's kind of like that positive and negative idea is like, it doesn't matter. The positive isn't going to cut it less in half. It's still getting cut in half. So using identity to try and fix an identity-based problem is just shooting yourself in the foot over and over and over, thinking that you're getting somewhere. And it's like thinking that if racism were the negative idea, then what we're doing now to counteract it is like the positive idea, and it's still cutting it in half the more we do it.
Yeah, because this is the problem. And I've said this before, that compassion taken far enough becomes fascism, right? Because eventually you have a group of people who are like, but this is the right thing, do it, rather than empathizing with people who don't understand that it might be the right thing or the more empathetic thing. And so all of a sudden, that empathetic thing isn't empathetic. It's creating oppression again, which is reinforcing the divide, which reinforces the rivalry and the conflict. And that's the whole point, right? It's not that we can't look at all of the different expressions of all of the different variations of human being across the planet. I'm not going to call it culture because I have an issue with culture, but I'm going to call it, say, habitual expressions in little pockets of humanity across the world. Okay, we can all appreciate the variation there. We can appreciate that one group of humans does a thing a certain way and they love it. They love doing it that way. We can appreciate that, but we don't have to go, and because they like doing it that way and we like doing it this way, we are different. You know, it's the same thing as somebody was saying that to me yesterday. It's like, well, if we're all one, why do I like a certain type of ice cream and you like a different type of ice cream? It's like, your body's all one. Not all of your organs have the same function, right? That's the point. Like division, or sorry, difference does not equal division. But we are so committed to the idea of race that it creates racism. Without the concept of race, you don't have racism. You know, this is one of the things I was really interested about, because I follow quite a few accounts on TikTok that are hosted by people of color. And fuck, even that seems weird to say. I just hosted by people. And the only reason I'm saying people of color is in case anybody's like, oh, another white guy, listen to more white guys. I just want to let you know that, you know, most of the people I listen to come from a diverse range of backgrounds, because that's how I learn so much in general. But what they were saying was they were going through the history of white people. And what's so very interesting is that it wasn't until around the 1600s or so where the term white people actually became a thing. Before then, it wasn't a thing, right? Because if you look at the history of Europeans hated each other, and they were all white. It didn't matter. Like Italians hated Polish people hated French people hated British people, and they were all white, right? So they didn't look at each other as like, yeah, we're all white people in this together. That came around, you know, where basically they had to naturalize slavery, and they were taking over the New World, and they were going down to Africa and doing that whole thing. And so there had to be a way to kind of rally people together. And so they coined this idea of white people. And eventually what happens when you have a general concept that embodies a lot of people, or that describes a lot of people, they start identifying with it. And here we are. Fact is that, you know, the idea of white people is weird. It doesn't even make any sense. I mean, we're all different shades at different times, different emotions and different conditions. Like it's just, it doesn't make it. We're just generalizing for the sake of having another way to divide ourselves. And the system, of course, loves it. The system loves it. I mean, we'd rather take care of minorities instead of stop viewing them that way.
Yeah, the savior complex is powerful for the ego. It makes me wonder with the grouping, like the larger and larger groups kind of going against each other. Is that, do you think, an egotistical process, like a deepening into identity in a sense? Like when we look at individual people, everyone's very unique. We like to use the term snowflake or something like that. Every snowflake's unique and different. And so do you think some convoluted egotistical process of like the collective ego of forming larger and larger groups, like being able to group people into people of color and white people? Or, you know, in the US, we have two major political parties, and it's just like you're either there or you're there. And the middle ground is like, people are just like, well, if you're in the middle, you know, on the left, they're like, if you're in the middle, you should be over here because we need more votes. And then on the right, they're like, oh, you're in the middle, then you're on the left. And it's like, oh, what the fuck? You can't not even be in one of them without getting labeled in another certain way. And so is it the broader grouping of things, or like Eastern culture versus Western culture? It's like the earth fucking massive and so unique. And we're like, oh, it's the West. Oh, it's the East. Like the person talking about Alan Watts, like, oh, he white dude took Eastern philosophies. Eastern philosophies? What are you including? Like Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, like as one fucking philosophy? Like, what the fuck? That is insane. And it with someone making that assumption, it's like they're able to just box it up and put it in a box and be like, yeah, that's a white dude taking Eastern philosophies. They don't even have to think for a second about what Eastern philosophy even fucking means, or that there could be tons of variations of Eastern philosophy. Like, how would you define Eastern philosophy? How would you define Western philosophy? Like, there are some massive generalizations you can make about it, but it makes me wonder with the collective ego, like this mass grouping of things allows us to not think about things so much, allows us to lack the awareness, like going back to the fucking intersection with the stoplights. And there's a big group of people, no cars coming, but it's a stop sign. So you stop. You don't have to pay attention. You don't have to look around. We just lack so much fucking awareness. And so by grouping, I guess this is just hit me now. Like by grouping people into massive groups, it allows us to not think about what's actually going on. Just be like, okay, well, I'm a white person who identifies on the left and follows Eastern philosophies. And it's like, that doesn't mean anything. You're just saying a bunch of words, but it fits that narrative. And then, you don't have to think about it anymore. And then it creates this inherent divide between yourself and everyone else that you also don't have to think about, but then they're all enemies. But because you know this for sure about yourself, even though there could be parts from the other side that you can utilize, and there's aspects of every different side and iteration that we can utilize to progress. And so this idea of grouping in bigger and bigger groups is a state of regression in a sense, because we don't have to think about things anymore. We're like, oh, they're a fucking Republican or they're a fucking liberal. Like, that's it. And that's it. It's like, well, there's probably some things on both sides that you think make sense. And people in America don't even make an opinion about a situation if they're deep in their party until their party makes an opinion about it. And I saw this with COVID stuff that happened, that there were people at work who initially, when everything started happening, they were like, oh, won't last that long. Like everyone's bugging out so much. And then they leaned left. And then the left was like, we're locking down. And they went so hardcore into it. And then their whole narrative shifted on its head. And like, they didn't even acknowledge how absurd it sounded, that all of a sudden what they identified as made a shift. So they didn't even think for themselves. And all of a sudden they're like, yeah, we got to do all this stuff. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And it's like, oh my, and same on the right. The same exact shit happens every time. It's fascinating.
And terrifying, right? But
Very.
It's the same mechanism as always, is our brain just wants to settle on an idea and not have to look at the uncertainty that is involved with all the nuance of that idea. That's nationalism and religion, right? It's pretty much the worst things about humanity comes from overgeneralizing an entire group of people and then wrapping them up in an idea and forgetting that they're human, just like you, right? Like that's exactly why we don't like looking at certain parts of our history where people just like us did terrible, terrible things, right? Because we forget, or we'd like to forget, that we have the capacity to do the same. Right? But it's in forgetting that we have that capacity that we tend to repeat it, right? And that's an important thing. I wanted to mention something here because there was somebody who left a comment, and I realized I think they stuck around and gave me a little bit of leeway, but they said, was following you guys until he said racism isn't real. And I just want to reiterate, racism, the concept that there is a division of value or potential between races, isn't real. I'd just like to say that. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't a shit ton of people who are stupid enough to believe that it is real and act accordingly. But the reality is it's just a concept. It's a concept based on a fiction and the illusion of self-image and a desperate need to evaluate yourself in comparison to anything. Yeah, I mean, typically somebody who's I'm going to say dumb enough to be racist, is the same kind of person who's dumb enough to think that your coat makes you better or worse than them. It's a superficial mentality. It's not based on anything except desperation and need. That's it. And on that level, racism is conceptual. It's based on fiction. It doesn't actually exist in the universe. And I know this as a father, watching my beautiful daughter grow up around people of color. God, I hate that expression. And not thinking of them that way. Because I don't think of them that way. And she was never conditioned to think of anybody else as separate simply because of a slight change in tone. It's not built in. It's not real. It's not based on reality. It's based on the same stupid fiction that created capitalism and religion and torture.
Yeah, and it's like the Martin Luther King Jr. famous quote. It'll be great, or I don't know exactly what it is, but it'll be great one day when we aren't regarded or judged or valued based on the color of our skin, but the content of our character. And yet we've gotten to a point now where people do, on the side of anti-racism, say that if you don't see the color of someone's skin or don't or judge someone based on the content of their character and don't first look at their skin color and then decide how to treat them, you're being racist. Like, that's how fucked we've gotten, is that by not deciding how to judge someone based on their race, even if you're, like appreciating them or being like a ally to people of color, like if you're judging someone first before you meet them in any way, even if it's positively based on the color of their skin, that's within racism. Judging someone based on the color of their skin, based on how they look, is prejudice, is
straight up
racism. Like, and we've gotten to a point now where we say that if you don't do that, you're being racist. That's how fucked we've gotten. That's how lost in identity and illusions that we've gotten, that we say literally the opposite of what it is. And we think that that's going to get us to the promised land of judging people based on how they look is going to end prejudice, which is based on judging people on how they look. It's so convoluted.
Welcome to woke culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Jesus Christ.
Which I always find woke to be the funniest damn thing. It's not even in the present.
Right? Like, oh my God. It's fascinating how it's almost like, give props to the collective ego for being able to get to that point where we've gone so far, like you were saying, on the side of compassion. What does compassion become? Fascism? When it's taken too far. Yeah. Like that's where we've gotten, is that taking identity to be the truth, we are now vilifying people who don't take it as the truth and recognize the concept, the inherent concept of the topic of judging someone based on how they look. Like, anytime you judge someone based on how they look, it's prejudice. Like, you're not even willing to talk to them or meet them or interact with them. It's honestly so fucking belittling to someone. It's dehumanizing to think that you could initially have an idea and treat them differently because of how they look. Anytime you treat someone differently because of how they look, you're being racist. You're being prejudiced. That's it.
Oh, it's not just race. It also goes to people who are more attractive than others, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. I do want to say something here quickly because we had a question. Just because I don't subject my daughter to racist point of view or the idea that race is a thing, that doesn't mean she can't see examples in the media or form ideas based on the external environment. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true, which is why I take parenting so seriously. My daughter trusts me more than the outside world because I've always been there for her. And because of that relationship, which came about through, again, practicing empathy and not setting divisions between myself and my daughter based on the parent child role. It's another division that doesn't exist. We're all human. We're all doing the same thing. I've just been here longer. But because of that mentality, if my daughter encountered, well, the first time my daughter did encounter some degree of racism was when one of her friends was being judged, and she came and she's like, I don't understand that. What is this about? And we talked about it. And that was it. That's as far as it went. She went, oh, well, that seems stupid. And it's like, well done. Lesson learned. Off you go. Have fun. And that's more or less it. But we take our kids, we put them in school. We don't see them for 8 hours a day, and we come home from work bagged, tired, don't want to talk about them, don't want to connect. Or worse, we have kids with the idea that that's what we're supposed to have, that's what's going to make us happy, that's what human beings are supposed to do. We don't question ourselves. We maintain this role of authority like they're our possessions, and we never ever establish any kind of relationship that's going to help us talk to them about these assumptions that every child's going to make at some point based on ego development. The first 3-4 stages of ego development is all based on self-image. There's going to be assumptions that are going to come into play. There's going to be toxicity that's going to form unless you're there going through the process yourself, reminding them like, right. This is just part of the process. That's not actually real. It's just something you think right now, and it's going to change, and going through it with them instead of just expecting somebody to shove enough knowledge in their head 8 hours a day that they can get a job and not cause any damage as a result. Like there's no nuance to the way we live because there's no awareness being practiced individually. But one person who is willing to be aware, who's willing to question, causes ripples. And that's it. That's all we're doing here is just causing ripples.
Yeah, the parenting label is an interesting one, I feel like, because yes, there are responsibilities to being a parent, but it doesn't mean it requires identifying with it to that degree. It makes me wonder, like, for you, obviously, I'm not a parent. I don't have any kids. So it's like not necessarily something I can speak on too much, but I'm curious when it comes to that lack of awareness and being there for your kid. Like, what do you think of parenting books and things like that? Like, because I feel like obviously any book, anything you read, and there's aspects of it that you can hold on to, but how much of that just allows someone to not have nuance and awareness in raising their kid because they're like just literally just going by the book. It's like Bible thumpers who just go by the book of the Bible and they don't think or have empathy. They're just like, well, the Bible says this, so I'm going to do this. It's like following rules in that way, like, or morality. It's like, can I do this? Let me scroll through here, and no, I can't. Okay, I'm not going to do this. It's like, what the fuck? You know what to do when you let go of all of those ideas that you feel like you have to hold on to exist within reality, and all of the bumpers that you put on to protect yourself, which really just cuts you off from that ability to tap into that deeper intelligence, that deeper awareness. And so when it comes to parenting, a lot of people get very overwhelmed because it is something that's super new to everyone. And so when it comes to those parenting books, like, I don't know, I'm curious what your thoughts are on those.
It's a really good question. A lot of nuance to it. Yeah, when you have a kid, it doesn't really matter what kind of person you are. It's like being reborn. You really don't know what the hell you're doing at all. On the one hand, I would say when it comes to taking care of your kid physically, in terms of how to take care of them, what they should be eating, how often you should be changing them, how to making sure they have enough sleep, making sure that they're safe when they're in their crib, like all that stuff. Parenting books are hugely useful in those terms because unfortunately, because of the society I was talking about earlier and the schooling system and the way that we parent, often we don't have any guidance when we have children. We don't have any tribe to show us how it's done. We've never been around people who have been doing it, and so we have no knowledge whatsoever, and quite frankly, everybody's fucking judgmental, so it's hard to reach out sometimes and ask for some advice without somebody lording it over you. So books are useful. Likewise, community programs where you can go in and ask for help or ask for some guidance, use those are great. Talking about subjectively, though, the experience of developing a relationship with your child, yeah, those books suck. Like, I just want to say, like, because they're always They're always one-sided. They're always looking at one perspective. This is the magic fucking trick. I actually had a book at one point for when I was first starting this parenthood journey called, I think it was 1, 2, 3 Magic. And it was like, 1, 2, right? And you count and like, all right, now there's a consequence, right? And they're like, this will teach your child. And I'll tell you right now, like, and the reason is because sometimes that's not the applicable thing. Sometimes being an authority is not helpful, right? Sometimes it's about being there with your kid as they go through this thing, but not always. Because learning how to deal with things on your own when people aren't necessarily holding your hand through every emotion is also important. And so there's a balance, but in order for you to establish or recognize that balance, you have to be questioning yourself. You have to be working on yourself all the time, right? So there's no parenting book in the world that is going to teach you sensitivity. But what we're looking for is just a how-to manual, because we're looking for that in every part of our life. It's not just with our kids, right? And so you'll find that the people who do that the least, people who face a problem and go, how can I work this out? Rather than who can fix this for me? Typically end up being the parents that are the most engaged with their children. Responsibility is a big indicator of self-awareness to a large degree, depending on where that responsibility comes from. If it comes from like a feeling of responsibility that's ingrained in your ego, totally different story, right? But people who are accountable for their reactions in the moment and what they take out of every experience, those people are typically really good parents. And I say good, but I mean attentive, engaged, aligned, sensitive, willing to actually grow with their kid, as opposed to assuming that their kid is the one who needs to grow because they're already an adult, which is a perception that you run across a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting how it seems like when somebody becomes a parent, it's like they fall into that role and they can get so caught up in their kid and that growth that they don't look at themselves at all, and they see themselves as a parent who's an adult who's already there. And it's like, I feel like they could potentially stop learning at that point, because they're like, this is just where I'm at. It's kind of like the idea of ourself becomes more solidified as we get into our mid-20s. And then there becomes less and less opportunities to recognize that maybe that's not the truth. And I think parenting is another, it's like cutting yourself off from that potential, cutting it in half, every single thing you identify with, like as a parent, is another thing that has the potential to cut you off, which is interesting. So when it comes to people, because there's a decent amount of people who have the perspective that harming your kid in order to make them more obedient is a rational thing, a reasonable thing, a reasonable way to raise a child. Like, how do those people not see that the action that they're taking in the moment, like when it comes to manifesting,
right? So we want to look at our life, and more importantly, we want to look at our parents in a certain way. And so we will justify what they did in raising us, just so we don't have a negative perspective of them and what we mean to them. Because if you think about it, right, if you convince yourself your parent loves you, and then you look back to a moment they took the strap to you, it's very difficult to rationalize that as love, unless you're willing to do it yourself. Because now you're like, look, I love you, just like my parents loved me. And so the justification, the need to justify, creates that cognitive dissonance, or rather it's what helps with the cognitive dissonance. All of a sudden we don't have to face that because we're reenacting it, convincing ourselves it's love, right? Whereas if we actually had a moment of awareness and we went, that didn't need to happen. Like, that was a result of authority and fear and self-image and a lack of ability to be sensitive to what the hell I was going through as a parent. Like, there was a disconnect there. That's where that came from. It doesn't mean your parent didn't love you. It just means that that was the best that they knew how to actually embody that love at the time. Doesn't mean that you should repeat it. It means you should learn from it, right? And recognize the experience that you had doesn't need to continue that way, right? It doesn't mean you have to judge your parents for it, because again, we're all at our different points in the journey, right? And it's really hard to recognize that, especially when you've been abused. I get that. right? But that's very much the case, is that it's incredible the mental gymnastics that we'll go through just so we can continue to feel good about the people who abused us, just because we love them and we want to feel like they loved us.
And all of that really comes down to our idea of ourself as being someone or something that is lovable. And so it's like, we, instead of recognizing the infinite potential that everyone has in every moment to act on any end of the spectrum and anything in between, hold on to this idea that they can only act positively. And it's like holding on to the idea of yourself as a good person. All of a sudden, everything you do has to be seen as good. And so you're not willing to see that, no, I have the potential to be anything and see things clearly. It's always going to be through that distorted veil, that distorted lens. And if the idea of yourself, you have that as a good person, then everything you're going to rationalize as good. And so because we see our parents in a certain way, because we want to see ourselves as lovable, we have to see them as loving. And so therefore, there goes the veil. It's like everything is loving. Therefore, that's rationalized then in that sense. And then all of a sudden, it's like it gets flip turned. So then we define loving as what they did, because we have to see them and what they did as loving. So then we equate those two. And then to act loving, we have to do the same shit. And it's so fun. That's wild. That's really interesting. But it all comes back to our idea of ourselves and the need that we feel to be loved. And then it's like, then it's so distorted that we then act in that way to those we love and those that are close. Yeah. So then it's like we're not even seeing it for what it is. Like, it's actually literally in a state of psychosis of thinking that this is being loving. Like, we've gotten so distorted that then we act in that way, thinking we're being loving. Holy shit.
Yeah. Need distorts everything. And that's the problem, right? Like, out of need, we will willingly live in an illusion that's causing us harm. And we won't even see it because of that need. And that's the reason my life coaching business was called Transcendence, was because you can't escape that while trying to cope with that need, because you're still just trying to find a way to soothe your identity, right? You actually have to go beyond where that need even comes from, which means you have to question the foundation that it rests upon, which is the illusion of you, right? You can't become a better parent. I think that's the fiction, is that you can only become a more free person, right? A more vulnerable and authentic person, a person who is more present. The idea of a better parent is a fiction that unfortunately causes a lot of people to be shitty parents. And it's true. There's so many parents I've talked to in my business where it's, I feel like a terrible mom, because you keep thinking about yourself as a mom, right? You're not. You're a human being. Nothing has changed since the day that your child came into the world. You're still the same child you were when you were born. It's just you've been here a long time, and now you've got this other iteration of you or variation of you that's trying to figure out things the same way that you did. Stop being the mom, stop being the parent, stop being the authority, just be in the shit with them, right? Get out of your own way enough where you can empathize with where they're coming from, and you'll have an insight about how to help them along. But I mean, as long as you're trying to be an adult or an authority or a parent looking down at your kid, you're only ever going to look through your own lens, which is why I prefer homeschooling to, and I say homeschooling, but I mean organic homeschooling, where the child very much dictates what they're interested in, where they're going. Because as adults, we tend to look backwards and go, well, this kid's got to be employable by 18. So we got to make sure he knows this and this and this and this and this, because this is all stuff that's important to me in my 40s as I look backwards. And we forget entirely that the journey of growing up was actually going through a bunch of shit that we don't even remember at this age. But that was super important to us at the time, right? And that's why our education system is so fucked.
It is absolutely fascinating how little from school, from the classes in the classroom, that I used in my job. Like, even college, that's the most recent thing. Literally nothing from my classroom. The things I learned were, human interaction and communication more through being on my baseball team with, between coaches and players and kind of bridging that gap and communication like that. I actually learned more for my job than anything, and managing different, identities and egos and the way people think of themselves. And so when you were talking about reinforcing identity and transcendence and getting into all of that. So we've talked about this on the podcast before when it comes to therapy. Something like that takes a much different approach than a lot of what we talk about all the time. And most of the time it's reinforcing the idea of yourself as truth, and then trying to work through that on the root core recognition that this is you. This is the truth of what you are, and we're going to work through that. And it's like running on a treadmill, thinking that you're going to move 100 feet forward. Like if not, moving backwards. It's just digging yourself deeper into identity, solidifying more. Let's go back into this experience. Oh, this has defined you to this point, as opposed to being able to let go of that in this moment here and now.
Well, look at belief, right? People will leave Christianity and go, oh, wow, what a crock of shit that was. I'm going to go explore paganism and find another belief. And it's because we never think to ourselves, oh, belief is the problem. It's that belief is the problem, right? That specific one. And the people who took advantage of me because of it. It's like, guess what? Any belief will eventually have people taking advantage of you because you've turned off your brain. You have turned off your awareness by settling on a belief, on a fiction, on an illusion. Somebody's eventually going to come over and use you for it. Somebody's eventually going to come over and twist that fiction to put themselves above you, because that's what fictions are for, to enrich and fill out. And the more you believe it, the more you're going to fall into line. It's a dangerous kind of magic.
Yeah, with that belief and therapy and things like that, it's not about having a more positive idea of yourself. It's not about getting rid of the negative idea of yourself. It's not about building it up, because as you think you're building it up, you're cutting that potential in half every single time. So it's not similar to the way that belief as a whole is the problem. It's not any type of belief system. It's just the act of belief. Yourself is the problem. Your idea of yourself is the problem. It's not this negative one that's rooted in this experience and that experience and that experience. It's that you're holding on to that as truth, because it's always going to cut you off from the flow. And so it has to be a letting go of that as truth, or at least an ability to take it less seriously in the moment here and now, because so far you've just been bringing it into every single moment and thinking that it's beneficial to all of the experiences. And meanwhile, it's just cutting yourself off. It's hindering your ability to fully experience reality in every moment. And yet we still hold on to it, thinking that having a more positive idea of it is going to be beneficial. And people do derive some benefit from therapy, but like, is it really? Because I've had some talks with people who are closer to me, who have been through therapy, or even friends who have gone on, like walks with, when I was back in New York, and we were talking, got into some of this stuff, and they're starting to talk about therapy. And I was like, I have a little bit of a different perspective on it. Like, you want to chat about it? And I'm always like, a little bit, I don't want to dive in and just totally, I don't know, like throw them off their boat there. But I've had some talks, and they've responded like, well, therapy benefited me. Like, how do you know it's not beneficial to everyone? And it's like, I don't know, it, to a degree, like, I get it, how it can, it's almost like, I don't know. I think it's similar to utilizing tools to get yourself out of a hole, but then, we use that identity. It's like our identity is useful to a degree. It's when we take it to be the truth, and something like that reinforces it. But I guess there could always be positives to something like that to a degree, but deep down, is it just fucking everything?
That's a really good question. I'm going to be careful because, of course, I'm married to a counselor. So I just want to say that it's very much like we were saying about the argument that, well, religion brings people together. Religion binds a community. Religion encourages people to connect with one another. Religion is a positive. It's like, see, humans doing those things are positives. The fact that they're doing it because of religion is actually a negative. It's actually working against them because there's all kinds of other things that go with religion as well. So I would say that in a religion, it's not that people are doing nice things because of religion, it's that people are doing nice things despite religion. Because religion itself is a form of identity and will automatically cut you off from everybody who doesn't agree with you or threatens you. Right? But people themselves want to come together. People themselves want to connect. They want to feel like they're in this together. We want to feel that unity. We really do. We like connection. We like being able to be at ease with people. Unfortunately, religion makes that very difficult because you're living up to a certain set of rules and guidelines and concepts of what a good person is and blah, 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 blah. So it creates all this distortion. Okay. That all said, therapy is very much the same. Therapy, people heal despite the therapy rather than because of the therapy. And I want to say, before anybody reacts to what I just said, what I mean is that there are concepts that you learn in school on the road to becoming a therapist or a counselor that, much like the parenting books that I was talking about earlier, are incredibly superficial. They're a how-to manual. If you see somebody with these characteristics, do this. There is no level of awareness that is taught through that type of schooling. Now, they will have you sometimes go and work in the field, or they will have you go through exercises that are meant to kind of put you in real world situations where you're dancing in the moment. But often you'll find that those students are still falling back to the how-tos. They're still looking for the concepts. And that's why when they graduate and they go to, and then they actually get into work, they will often say, I don't feel like I know enough. And it's because they're looking for more concepts. They're looking for more structure. They're looking for more how-tos. If this, then this, then this, right? And the problem with therapy is that it's meant to be a relationship, right? Any good therapist is going to tell you that it's not the therapy that's doing the work, it's the safe space. It's the connection between the therapist and the person who's coming to them. It's the relationship that allows that person to feel safe enough to actually question themselves, to work through their own stuff. So while there are plenty of egotistical therapists who will say, oh, I've helped this many people heal, and I've done all this and so on and so forth, most good therapists will tell you that it's the person healing themselves. And it's just that you're giving them the space and the relationship and the, I guess, the environment that they need in order to try and facilitate that change in their own lives. You might even be reminding them that they have the capacity to change. You might be reminding them of things that they know deep down, but have lost sight of because of the illusion that they've fallen victim to, or that they've habitually kind of grilled into their head. So on that level, I would say that, again, therapy is a superficial band-aid that is often used by egotistical assholes, whereas a therapeutic relationship is something else entirely, and it doesn't involve ego, or at least it should remove as much ego as possible, because at least then you can have a conversation without judging the person you're talking to, without assuming you know what the hell is best for them, because you don't. Okay, but you can help them find what's best for them based on what they know, and that's it. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's very much like religion. I think that the connection between people is the positive. I think that we cover it up and we go, oh, look, it's therapy, or oh, look, it's religion. And it's very much because we want to believe in therapy and we want to believe in religion. You know, we want to believe there's a quick fix to being a good person.
Yeah, it's interesting when we recognize that more clearly. And it goes together a lot with our mentality in the moment is what dictates everything about our experience. And so and anytime we hold on to a concept that cuts us off from that mentality because we're trying to be some idea, it's going to hinder our ability to do so. So it's like in this specific situation, if you're thinking of yourself as a therapist here to help this person, and you're doing it to help them, and you're being here to help them, and you have a lot of ideas of yourself involved, it's going to completely hinder your ability to actually help them. So you're better off, a lot of times they're probably better off just talking to someone who doesn't identify as anything, not even, necessarily a coach. And people will bug out and they'll be like, oh, well, if you, don't have the piece of paper, like, you shouldn't do this. And I understand to a degree. It's like, but if someone's able to embody that mentality and just be there for them and be that sort of reflective space, that safe space, like, odds are they're probably going to get a lot more out of that type of situation than someone who's super identified and has learned a bunch of concepts, because the concepts aren't applicable to every given situation. They're applicable to something that's in a book or a cookie cutter situation. So it's almost like becoming a therapist, like, go through it, get the piece of paper, and then fuck everything and just be there with the person, and think of yourself not as a therapist, but with, the piece of paper. So the people come to you and pay you and whatnot for being a therapist or a counselor or whatever. And that's very interesting. And it made me think of, I've been talking to one of our family friends, my mom's friend, her dad, who's pretty old, has terminal cancer and probably has a couple months to live. And he's having a very difficult time with the impending death. And so she has looked into psychedelics in the past, and my mom was talking to her, and, she's like, Andrew loves talking about this stuff. Like, I'm sure he could chat with you. He probably has some that he could send you or whatever. And, so I've been talking to her a little bit about it, and she's looked into some different things. She was curious. She's, done a bunch of research herself in the last couple of years, just like in general. And she's been interested in it, but hasn't done them, isn't super sure about it. And so we were talking about the idea of taking him to a guide to have an experience versus her just being there with him. And we were talking through it, and I was explaining to her that, it's not necessarily so much that it's the guide doing anything. It's like the space that is created with that. And so if he's able to be in a space that is very calm, relaxed, there's not the potential for things to go awry, he's with someone that he trusts, like, the guide isn't so much important. Like, the experience is still going to be his experience. And so whether it's, her with him, because I don't know if they're in, middle of the country. I don't know how many guides there are around necessarily. And she was like super unsure about that. I was like, if you can be there for him and just like keep him calm and relaxed, like, that's what is going to be most beneficial. And it's the same for, applying it to therapists versus maybe a life coach who hasn't gone to school. It's more so about the environment and the ability to have that connection with the person, as opposed to, what all of their prerequisites are. And, something like the retreat, for example, is another situation in which people are able to have that experience. It's not about us being there. It's the environment that is created based on the collective mentality of everything, because it always comes back to you. It's not about the people that you're with in terms of their identities. It's about the environment that's created that the people are obviously a part of, but it's not them doing it. And then the experience, when it comes to any type of psychedelic experience, it comes back to you. Like, it's happening to you, within you, as, an aspect of the environment and everything's impacting everything all the time. But it really comes back to you and the environment that you're in, which also includes you. That's the most important part. So the work always comes back to you. Who you're with can help facilitate that experience, but it's not going to have quite the impact. It's not the person that you're with that's doing it for you. And with this idea that, we want to be less and less aware, we like to think that, but, and lack responsibility and all of that, but it really always comes down to us.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. The retreat is a perfect example, because we were just there. We weren't in any capacity. We weren't acting as therapists or coaches or anything. We were just there as human beings going through shit, which is everything that everybody's going through. And so we could just relate to everyone on that level. And as a result of being able to honestly relate with vulnerability and authenticity in an environment where there was no judgment, we all rapidly moved through our shit because we are process, we are intelligence. That's exactly what our potential is to move through our shit. It's just that there's so much that we hold on to, or there's so much around us that's holding us back, or that's making us think that we have to hold ourselves back. And so, yeah, just changing the environment. Everything. I'm going to mention very quickly that we have a second retreat coming up April 1st to April 9th on Vancouver Island in Canada. It's going to be amazing. It's the same location as the first retreat, same service providers. We're going to have a classical guitarist come in twice in that week to play for us privately. It's going to be beautiful. We've got group yoga. We have Chef Caitlin and all of her incredible creations for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and dessert. All week long. It's all covered by the ticket price. Tickets are only available at the moment to our Patreon supporters. So if you would like to join us on Patreon, just go to patreon.com/dualistic-unity. Access to the tickets will be given out according to your tier this month. And then, of course, it will be publicly available on December 23rd for anybody who would like to buy a ticket. Again, April 1st to April 9th. That all said, I want to go back to something that you were saying about how often you'll hear people go, well, you're not trained, so therefore you shouldn't be out there giving advice to anybody and blah, 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 blah. And that's a lot of, I'm going to credit that, to the Association of Counselors doing a wonderful job protecting their jobs. All right, because that's ultimately what it comes down to. And the reason I say that is this. Not that there aren't people out there who are going to do harm because they're egotistical and they're basically trying to feel like saviors rather than worrying about the people that they're helping, because God knows there's enough of those fucking people around. But the fact is, I'm going to say that that's my point, is that if you honestly have the good intention of just being there for someone, you're not trying to be their savior, but you've rid yourself of enough of your own need and conflict that you can just be there, then just be there. Don't listen to these people who are like, oh, you're not trained. And guess what? Neither are most of the people that person's going to talk to. Okay, so if they're going through their whole day running into egotistical assholes who are trying to take advantage of them or judge them, and they run across you once, and you have 5 minutes of their time to just leave some positive ripple, or at least authentic, clear, safe ripple, do that. Do that. Don't think to yourself, well, I don't have my credentials. Because I'm going to tell you right now, there's a lot of people with credentials who are total assholes. They don't help. You can't teach self-awareness. So as long as you know your intentions are pure, that it comes from a place of empathy and not ego, give that person your space and your time for as long as you can. You're not trying to fix anything. They're fixing it. All you have to do is just not be needy. That's it. Just don't be needy. Leave yourself at the door for as long as they need. And then you've done your job. You don't need training for that. You don't need training for that because you're not trying to get them anywhere. It's the people who are trying to get them somewhere that are the dangerous people, because they're trying to do so based on what they think is best for them. And we don't fucking know. We don't know, regardless of how much training we've had, regardless of how many credentials we have, regardless of how much we make per fucking month, regardless of the office space that we live within or work within. None of that matters. Doesn't matter what you drive. Doesn't matter how you dress. Doesn't matter how professional you fucking think you are. None of it equals self-awareness or empathy. So don't judge a therapist based on how much they make or how successful they think they are or how many certificates are on the wall behind them, because none of it means a damn thing when it comes down to the authentic space that you're within with them, if they can make room for you or if it's entirely taken up by their ego.
And them thinking that they know what's best for the person is going to hinder the ability for the person to figure out what's best for them. Like, the person knows what's best for them better than anyone. And so it's facilitating an environment that allows them to figure that out for themselves, but it's not going to be figured out by the therapist. It's not going to be figured out by the person that they're with. So if they're coming in holding on to an idea that they're going to fix this person, they're going to figure out what's best for them and then help them get there. It's like, we've talked about this before, that not having a solid idea or being unsure of how you're going to be able to help someone is kind of the best mindset to go into, something with, because it leaves you open. As soon as you think you know what the best way to go about something is for the person, or have some preconceived notion, obviously, that arises as you're in the conversation with them. Thoughts, ideas, perspectives come up. But if you go into a situation thinking you know what's best for them and how it's going to go and everything, you're going to cut yourself off from the flow. You're going to shoot yourself in the foot before you even begin. And it's the same with any identity that we hold on to going into any situation, whether it's a positive idea or a negative idea, or that we're going to be a savior or that we're worthless. Like anytime we go into any situation with an idea, we're shooting ourselves in the foot before we even begin. It's like going into a race and literally shooting yourself in the foot before you start. Like you got one leg, good luck. But that's how we're living. That's how we're existing in society. Like that's how all of society is being run right now. Everyone's running around as if society's a race. They shoot themselves in the foot. And then halfway through, they shoot themselves in the arm. They shoot themselves in the other arm. And they don't even realize what they're doing. And that's what we're doing when we're identifying. We're inhibiting our ability to move forward because we're holding on to this idea. And so in every single moment, we're going in with that idea of who we are, of what we are. So we're not able to actually progress. Like if you think of life as a race, which I don't love that analogy, but it's in terms of progression, maybe the end of the race is, toward running towards yourself, or recognizing unity, letting go with each step more and more of your idea of yourself. Like as we're doing that, every time we identify, it's like we're cutting off a limb, or we're, I don't know, like weighing ourselves down. Exactly. Yeah. Like we're every identity.
Like a VR helmet. Right?
Yeah.
You ever wore a VR helmet? Like or been in VR?
Yeah.
Your brain very quickly switches to the fact that this is reality now. It's exactly the same. We're trying to wander through life wearing a VR helmet, and we're interacting with something that isn't reality.
Yeah, fucking A. And like every concept we hold on to changes the VR. And it's like, it's getting more and more distorted. It's kind of like it's like literally like veils. Like every idea that we have is another veil. Then we have 20 ideas about what we are, like in Discover Transcendence, the video that you made. Look in the mirror and think of 10 things you would define yourself as, then mark them as positive versus negative. And any of those things are going to veil you. Like all of those ideas veil you, or at least shift your perspective on reality. And so you're not seeing things clearly. You're interacting with everything through this limited idea of yourself that isn't fucking real, but you think that it is. And you're not willing to question it. And then as those things pile up, you see everything else that you hold on to, or something else, some other perspective that someone, tells you that's the way it is when you're growing up, or a parent tells you something, and another layer gets added, and that distorts everything moving forward. And it's like exponential at that point too. It's like the network effect. Like every time a new idea comes in, it's like 4 other ideas stem from that limit you even more. And from that, 4 more or whatever it is out of that. And then all of a sudden we're literally so caught up in this bullshit idea of what we think is real that we're so distorted. And that's where our suffering is based, in thinking that it's real when it isn't.
Yeah. Well, to the point where we actually don't know that there is something that's real. Like we actually don't know that we're lost in something. That's the biggest thing. I mean, for the longest time, you hear things like enlightenment or waking up, and you're like, oh, that's interesting as a concept, right? You don't recognize that it's an actual thing. It's not another fucking badge to put on your fucking shirt or anything, right? Like it's actually the cessation of that mentality entirely. You don't know what you don't know, right? That's the problem, is that, and of course, because nobody around us is embodying it, right? Like a perfect example of that article that you shared with us yesterday about the 5 monks being found to have crystal meth in their system. These 5 Buddhist monks having crystal meth in their system, including their abbot. And instead of the reaction being, obviously something is bothering our brothers, obviously there's some reason that they're doing this. We should connect with them. We should try and help them find their way back to that sense of being. No, they defrocked them, they dismissed them, they kicked them out of the monastery and said, it's your job to help people find enlightenment. Like, that doesn't sound like an egotistical task or an egotistical achievement. So obviously the people that they were working for are just as fucking lost. So now you're like, oh, okay, I can understand why you're doing crystal meth at the monastery, because you're working for a boss who sucks. I can relate to that. Right? In which case, the entire point of the monastery is gone. The entire point of Buddhism is fucking gone because people are identifying as Buddhist. And with that, eventually there comes this degradation of the insight. All of a sudden you're seeing little Buddha statues everywhere instead of looking in a fucking mirror. Right? And that's the point, right? Buddha's like, find your Buddha nature, not his Buddha nature. Right? If his name was Pete, he'd be telling you, find your Pete nature. Right? Find your nature, what you are without your self-definition, what you are without the illusion. That's it. But instead we put little Buddha statues everywhere, like he was the important part.
Because we're so, like, our entire experience is rooted in our idea of ourself, everything's fucked. Like, everything is fucked. Every idea, every concept, everything that could potentially be beneficial just becomes another weight. Like I'm a Buddhist, another weight, because I'm a Buddhist, instead of recognizing what it actually is, which is letting go of Buddha. That idea. Yeah. Like, and it's all like, that's why we harp on identity so much, because if you don't recognize that as being the root of your suffering, anything that you hold on to, even something that could potentially be pointing to the truth or have some beneficial message, will be distorted and fucked. And it'll only weigh you down and increase your suffering, because you're adding it to this identity as opposed to utilizing it as a tool without taking it so goddamn seriously and taking it to be the truth. Like, if you're rooted in your idea of yourself as being the truth, then anything you recognize or hold on to, no matter how fucking spiritual you are, is going to weigh you down, is going to distort all of it, is going to deepen your inability to recognize what is actually happening. It's going to add veils, add layers to your distorted perception of reality.
Regardless of how good your intentions are.
Yeah.
Regardless. And it's so important to recognize that. Like, I remember learning about the Sufis at one point. And Sufis are kind of a branch of Islam, about as fucking radically different from Islam as you can get. So it's really kind of an interesting branch. But their entire point is that the discovery of God, or the reality of God, happens when you stop wanting. But why would you become a Sufi if you didn't want to achieve God or to contact God? So you're immediately fucked, because you're trying to get to God, so you're letting go of your want, which is based on a want. So it's reinforcing your identity again, and that division. How sad is that?
Yeah, so it's like you got to recognize it without identifying with it, like with every religion. Yeah. I mean, not everyone. Well, yeah.
They can't be. You can't define yourself and be everything. Right? You can't take it seriously at the very least. And if you're not taking it seriously, why are you calling yourself that? Right? It's different to say, well, my name is Ray. That's a matter of convenience. But to go out of my way to call myself a Zen monk or a Sufi or a guru or goddamn anything, that's all conceptual. That's all self-definition. That's all, I'm here because I have this purpose now in this place. And it's all narrative. Like, it doesn't matter. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed except your perception of yourself, and it's getting in your way again.
Yeah, fucking A. And how often are the consequences so easily shown, like so readily available? Like, how often we get offended now based on things like, you should be calling me this, you should be calling me that. It's like, it sounds fucking tiring to be reminding people all the time of what they need to call you. Like that sounds like it's creating a lot of suffering within yourself. And yet you think that it isn't? Or do you enjoy the suffering? Like, is that what it is? It that half-ass backwards egotistical idea of the ego doesn't want to die, and so if you're suffering more and creating it for yourself, then you're more because you're suffering more.
No, it's cognitive dissonance. It's the fact that I'm so completely enwrapped in the benefit of my strategy. I won't recognize the consequence. I won't, because then I'd have to stop doing it. Right. And so I just focus on the benefit, on the positive of what this belief is going to do for me. It's going to raise me up. It's going to make me feel more valuable. It's going to do all that. And at no point do I look at the fact that it's also making me have a reason to fear. It's also giving me something that can be torn down. It's also giving me something that's cutting me off from everybody I'm talking to. I'm not looking at any of that because I'm focused on how good this feels. I don't want to look at that.
You see my chat? You good?
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm kind of referring to is pronouns. Like people get so fucking caught up in all these people need to call me this thing. And it's fascinating. Like it's become very insidious to the point that at the job I just left, I've been there for 4 years. Like everyone has their pronouns in their bio. And it's rooted in what you were talking about, good intentions, being more accepting, being more inclusive, kind of like how, you know, the definition of religion is to unify or is to bind together. Like we think that that's what it's doing, but all it's doing is dividing, further dividing. Like it's fucking fascinating. It's another identity. Like and it's so many things in encapsulated in one little thing, like identity, expectation, belief, need, all in this one little thing. But it's interesting how insidious it's gotten. And now it's like, you got to call someone by this. And if you don't, you're a piece of shit. And it's like, why do you need people to call you that? Like, what need are you holding on to? Like, where does that come from? Like, I guess it's the cognitive dissonance that you were just talking about, but it's so fascinating. Like, why do you need someone to call you that? Is that where your value is derived from? And then people come up with all different things like, I go by her, they. It's like, you're making this fucking confusing as shit for everyone. And you're making it more difficult for yourself because then anytime someone doesn't remember to call you that or doesn't know because they haven't seen your fucking pronouns, that you're like, you feel bad inside because you feel like they're not respecting you. So you're really just, again, shooting yourself in the foot. Like, oh my God, what the fuck?
Yes. And you can tell because of this one thing. And this is the one thing that is the big giveaway when it comes down to this. So the non-binary pronouns that are used are they, them, right? But those are plural. The individual pronoun they're looking for is it. And you notice nobody wants to use that.
Fucking shit. Yeah. Oh man. So like what are obviously, you know why someone doesn't want to use X? It like is the most dehumanizing thing you could ever think of. But yeah, they, them is plural. Yeah. That's interesting.
Isn't it though? And it's just because I don't like the way that one feels. I don't like the way that word feels at all. I don't want to identify as it. It's like, all you've done is it identifies plural it's. Right? They, them. I mean, you're saying you're non-binary. The non-binary individual term is it. You know, neither male nor female. And that's fine, but we just don't like the way that feels. And it's because it doesn't give us a positive mental image of ourselves. Right? Whereas they, them, to those who are looking for a definition that's different than the one that society has said is what one you're supposed to be looking at, right? They'll go for the one that's, you know, as far outside of that idea as possible because they don't want to be that idea. And that makes sense. And the problem isn't necessarily he, she. The problem is that we think that means something. The problem is that society's like, oh, he, this is he, this is she. And then we buy it and we're like, well, I'm neither of those. So I've got to be this. Like, no, because neither of those were anything either. Neither of those were anything either. That's the whole point. Okay. The only thing this was ever meant to be was supposed to be a convenient way to tell apart our biology. That was it. And they will say gender is a social construct, therefore an illusion. When we're saying social construct, we're saying a mutually decided upon illusion. And if we're that far away from reality, where we're actually defining ourselves according to illusions that other people have to validate and agree with, how are we surprised that we're going through suffering? How are we surprised that we're in conflict? We're living in an illusion, and we're demanding that everybody abide by that illusion, whether they know about it or not. Like, this is something that we very much forget in North America as we go through this gender identity pronoun argument. Most of the rest of the world doesn't even consider it to be an argument. They don't even think of it as a conversation. It's very much a product of our current societal structure. And I'm going to say it, the amount of comfort and privilege in the world. Like, let's just say, okay, because nobody ever talks about this, but the entire idea of transitioning as a transgender person would not happen in a world that wasn't way distorted with capitalism. It would not happen for somebody who was, let's say, a person of color, somebody going through poverty. Okay, the entire idea of having gender surgery and transitioning takes a certain degree of privilege. It takes a certain degree of money, and it takes a certain degree of comfort to do all that stuff, but we never talk about that. Right. And what's worse is that we have this idea now that's being promoted that if you do think that you're trans and you aren't getting the surgery, then you're obviously not trans, that you're not doing enough. And it's like, no, stop that. Because again, everything's a transition. Like, there was a certain period of my life where I thought I was a metalhead. Did I go out of my way to make myself into a metalhead? No, because I change as a person. Concepts change all the time. Concepts change all the time. And that's the whole point. You're not one. You're not a concept. You know, if you decide that you have, I was having this conversation yesterday between this idea of masculine and feminine. And the idea is, unfortunately, another generalization, because Jordan Peterson talks about this, but I'm not citing him as a source, but I am citing the research that he's talking about, which is that often men and women have a difference in what they are primarily interested in. Okay? Men are primarily interested in things, women are primarily interested in feelings. Okay, and that's an overgeneralization, but across the board, across studies, you can see it's about a 70-30 split. Okay, on average. Then the opposite is also true, that 30% of the female population displays interest in things versus feelings, and 30% of the male population interest in feelings versus things, right? So neither of them are actually male or feminine traits. It's just that we observe them more on one side or the other right now. Would that have been the case 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years from now when society has changed? I don't know. But because we see it as an observed distinction between one group and another, we go, well, that's obviously because that group is this way, instead of, oh, that group is this way right now, right? So we go, men are more interested in things, when we know that's not the case. We know that that is just a generalization. We know that, but we don't ever question that when all of a sudden we go, well, I don't think about things, therefore I'm not a man, right? It's just, it's so easy to fall into the trap of overgeneralizing.
And I think that's the egotistical mentality that I was talking about before with the larger groups, is the idea of generalizations. And with that, it's like, it allows us to not think into a situation or think about what any of this means, or it incites or requires us to take it seriously, the concept, and believe that it's a truth. And with the transitioning conversation, like we've talked about this before, that process of recognizing that you're not what you think you are is a process towards, waking up, towards recognizing that illusions aren't the truth. Identity isn't the truth. But in a super fucking egotistical world where if you're not this, you must be this. Like, oh, I don't think I'm this, and therefore I'm this. And because, the concept of male and the concept of female and what that entails, the generalizations are taken to be the truth, what it means to be a male or a female, we confuse that with the biological aspect of it as being the truth. So the things that I enjoy, if it doesn't fit the male narrative, it must be female. It doesn't have to do with your biology. It just has to do with your preferences. But because we've taken the concepts and ideas of what we define them as to be the truth, we think that our preferences must fit into something. And when it doesn't, that's what it leads to. And it's so fascinating and so interesting. And with the privilege side of it, like so many of the things that we deal with in our society, so many of the things that we talk about and how we have to walk on eggshells around everything is a product of living in a super fucking privileged society. Like overall, we don't have to worry, thinking back to our ancestors, we don't have to worry about wild animals coming and ripping our tent apart and eating our family anymore. We don't have to worry about going to get food. We have refrigerators. Like there's so many things that have created this level of comfort that it allows us to even to suffer mentally. Honestly, like if you're dealing with a bunch of physical shit where you're worried about your family getting eaten or another tribe coming in and murdering everyone, you're not having mental health issues. Most likely.
Depression.
Way less depression. Like way less identity because you're just involved in the shit that you got to be involved in. You're worrying about staying alive. It's like we've kind of gotten to a checkpoint now where we don't have to worry about that. Now we have antibiotics, so we're able to live to be 80, 90, 100 years old. And so we got to fill our brain with something, or we think we do. It's like, well, let's create this idea of myself and then defend it over anything, over everything. And create all these. How many identities can I hold on to? How many fucking veils can I create for myself that distorts my ability to see reality clearly? Let's see how many. It's almost like a contest these days. How many things can I create about myself? And all of those veils are an opportunity to get offended. Also, so we sit there getting offended and getting angry because we don't have all this other shit that we have to worry about anymore. So it is like so much of it is rooted in privilege. It's fascinating, but not willing to do that because, privilege is very much in America, at least, very much a right side of the aisle deal. And left side of the aisle is the transitioning process. So that couldn't be of privilege because, they're now a minority and they're someone who has this suffering that they experience because they're going through something. And this is now a part of this narrative. And both sides are fucked. Both sides are rooted in identity. Doesn't matter how many fucking veils you put on, how many weights you put on, they're all going to slow you down. They're all going to inhibit your ability to recognize the truth of what you are, which will lessen your suffering. All of it is inhibiting that ability, but we keep pushing it.
Well, because our society is immersed in the illusion of identity. Like that's it. We don't even see what we're doing. We don't even understand that what we're doing is harmful. We actually, again, it's good intentions. Like we actually think like, oh, okay, so this person has found an identity that's making them feel better in the short term. Identity is something we're not willing to question. So therefore, we must back up this strategy. It's like, so we were saying before, right? It's like we question negative identities, but not identity itself. We question negative beliefs, but not belief itself. Right. And so we have an entire system, capitalistic system, that's very much based on us all identifying and competing and comparing and being divided. And so along comes another strategy to identify in a new way, and we're like, yeah, that works. And it works mostly because it was championed by a celebrity. One of the most interesting things I thought was when Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner came out and they're like, that's it, I'm now a trans woman. And they made the cover of, oh God, I can't even remember which magazine it was. I think they were like Woman of the Year that year. Right?
Vogue?
I think so. Right. But so that year, this person who changed their identity to be a woman. And again, I know 15, 20 years ago, women who were struggling for equality would have come out and go, as if this is another example of a man trying to take a woman's attention. I know that for sure. But anyway, what I thought was really interesting is that society, because of the magazine and because, again, Caitlyn Jenner is a celebrity and all of this, just went, woo, yeah, you're a champion, woman of the year, yay. At the very same time, there was a woman, I think in Ohio, who identified as being Black. She identified as African American, okay, and worked for the NAACP. Okay, so nobody knew a thing. This woman was not Black. This woman actually went out of her way to tan regularly in order to maintain the skin tone, and had her hair done all the time so that it resembled African American hair. Okay, so she wasn't Black. I want to make that clear. This woman was as white can be. She was straight up European descent. Okay, but she looked absolutely Black to the point where everyone she worked with and knew thought she was. Then the same year that Caitlyn Jenner was lauded as becoming a woman, this other woman's life was run through the fucking ringer because it was found out that she's not naturally African American, and identifying as African American doesn't make you one. See the hypocrisy there? Identifying as something doesn't mean that you're that. Oh, but it does over here. Look, the cover of this magazine. It was in the same year, man. Like, it was happening at the same time, and nobody said a thing.
That's fucking crazy. Like, holy shit. So why do you think that is then, that we're okay with them? Is that the patriarchy at play that's been so insidious that we're okay with men taking over? The same thing happened at fucking my alma mater at Penn. A male who was on the swim team, who was like mediocre, still D1 swimmer, so pretty solid, but wasn't winning national championships, transitioned to a woman, or I didn't even transition, started identifying as a woman with a dick, and started swimming on the women's team, like literally at Penn, on the same opposing, on the female team, starts winning fucking championships. And people are lauding that. Like, how?
Except their teammates.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the sad part. But if they say anything, they're being transphobic. Right. And so we're no longer empathizing with them because we're protecting identity. Somebody just asked this question. They're obviously new to the conversation. I really want to address this quickly because we are going to be taking off to Patreon here in about 5 minutes. What's wrong with identity? I'm not going to tackle this one. I'm going to pass this over to Andrew, and I'm going to invite everybody who has enjoyed this conversation to join us at patreon.com/dualistic unity after this in about 5 to 10 minutes. At the top of the hour, we'll be there for another 2-hour conversation where we can continue this. It's been a lot of fun. But Andrew, what's wrong with identity?
Oh, man. I feel like this. Well, if you're interested in hearing the long answer, go check out the close to 80 some odd episodes of Dualistic Unity podcast. But I'll start with Krishnamurti quote that I mentioned before. There is no conflict without I. So therefore, conflict with I. Identity reinforces your idea of yourself in many, many, many different ways. And it's always an illusion. It's all rooted in these concepts and these ideas. And it creates a distortion with reality. And the further you get from recognizing that you are just what is here and now, and any idea of yourself will cut you off from being able to experience what many call flow state, which is, being able to interact with reality without so much idea of yourself, which begets freedom and peace, less suffering and everything. But anytime you hold on to a concept as the truth, it's going to create more and more and more suffering for yourself because it immediately causes conflict with reality. You're holding on to an illusion, an idea of yourself that's almost always rooted in the past and some idea of something that's happened in the past. So take an example of something that has happened in the past. Say, you did a test for a certain class when you were younger and you didn't do super well because maybe you didn't study as much. And then so you get put in, say it's a math test, and then you get put in the lower math class. Out of the 3 classes, you're in the lowest one. So then immediately an identity begins to form. I'm not good at math. And so every time moving forward, you do something with math, you go in with this belief, I'm not good at math. And then every time it's just deepening and deepening that identity because you're going in with this belief about yourself that isn't good at math. And so are you going to be able to be good at math moving forward? Probably not, because you have this identity that comes into every single situation. But what if you didn't have that identity? What if you went into every situation anew and you didn't think, I'm bad at math? You were just like, I don't have any identity. I'm going to go into this and see what happens. And this is all only because you didn't study the first time. But all of a sudden, all this shit piles up now. And now you're tell yourself you're bad at math for your entire life. Whereas there's actually an example of this, of someone who wasn't a great student, or I don't know if it's real or not, and they took the SAT, standardized test. And yeah, it is real. And they took the standardized test, and they were, C, D student their whole life, took the standardized test, SAT, ACT, whatever it was. And they took it, didn't think they did great, came back, they did super well, got like 99th percentile, went on to be a super successful serial entrepreneur, found a bunch of companies because all of a sudden their identity shifted. Or at least they let go of the previous identity of being a shitty student. And so it opened up all of these doors. Turns out 10, 15 years later, they found out that those tests actually came back incorrectly. They actually did super poorly. They got like 40th, 50th percentile on that. But because that they thought that they did better, that identity shifted, or they were able to let go of that past identity. And all of a sudden they didn't have so much, or their identity became, they were able to see more clearly that, oh, maybe I'm not this. And they questioned it, and they were able to be forced to question it. And so they were able to move forward and be better at it. And it's the same thing. Anytime you hold on to identity, it's going to cut off your potential to achieve any potential, basically. And so that's a spiel about identity and the issues with it.
That was a very short, well said summary. There's a lot to it. That's basically the short end of it. And unfortunately, you came in at the very end of our live stream today, that we will be live streaming again this week. So keep an eye out. If you want to go to dualisticunity.com, check out our group and live schedule, or live streaming schedule. You will see all the times that we're going to be available. As of right now, though, we're going to log off here, end today's episode, and we will continue on Patreon. So if anybody can join us there, we'd love to see you. Of course, you'll have a chance to actually get on the screen with us, ask some questions, talk to us directly. It's a lot of fun. And of course, it gives us a chance to engage with you on a more one-on-one basis. So we're going to end this here. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. But did you want to do the intro right now for this, or do you want to record it separately?
We'll record it after.